A warm, golden scent drifts through the cold morning air, the first sign of life in a sleeping medieval town. This is the smell of fresh bread, a simple aroma that meant survival for hundreds of people. But how could one baker, using just a single oven, possibly produce enough food for an entire population day after day? By the end of this story, you will understand the brilliant and often ruthless system that turned grain into power and kept civilization from collapsing. We will uncover the secret laws that governed every loaf and the hidden workforce that made it all possible. What does it take to build a society on the foundation of bread? That single baker standing before the pre-dawn oven held a position of immense power and vulnerability. In the rigid structure of medieval life, he was a cornerstone, as essential to the community as the blacksmith who shod the horses or the miller who ground the grain. But his role was far more precarious. A baker did not simply run a business. He answered directly to the lord of the manor, bound by feudal obligation to provide bread for the castle and its retinue. In growing towns, he operated under a strict charter from the local government, a document that granted him the exclusive right to bake, but also subjected his every move to official control. The entire social order depended on his daily success. A consistent supply of affordable bread meant a calm, productive populace. A single day of failure, however, could ignite fear, and a prolonged shortage was a direct path to chaos. The threat of bread riots was a constant shadow over every medieval ruler and official. This meant the baker lived under a microscope, watched by his customers, his competitors, and the authorities. Every loaf he pulled from the fiery mouth of his oven was a small brick in the wall of civilization itself, and he bore the crushing weight of knowing that if his hands failed, that wall could crumble into unrest. Stepping through the low doorway of that bakery, you would leave the quiet street behind and enter a world of intense heat and constant motion. The air itself felt thick, a swirling mix of flour dust and the dry scent of burning oak. This single room was a carefully organized engine of production. At the front, a simple wooden counter faced the street, the public face of the operation where finished loaves were sold. But the true heart of the place lay further in, dominated by a colossal, arched structure of brick or stone. This was the oven, a permanent fixture built directly into the building, often large enough for a person to crawl inside. Its dome was designed to absorb and radiate heat with incredible efficiency, a technology that had been perfected over centuries. Before the first batch of dough was even shaped, this giant would be prepared for its duty. A roaring fire was lit inside its dark chamber, fed with wood for hours until the interior bricks glowed with a dull orange light. Only when the temperature was just right would the fire be allowed to die down. The baker then used a long, wet mop to sweep every last ember and ash out onto the floor, leaving behind a perfectly clean, scorching hot cavern ready for the bread. Around this central beast, the rest of the workspace was arranged for pure function. Massive wooden troughs, some as long as a man is tall, held the rising dough. Kneading such enormous quantities was a brutal, physical task that required strong arms and a strong back. Leaning into the dense, sticky mass was a daily battle against gravity and gluten. And to safely deliver the raw loaves into the oven's fiery mouth, the baker relied on his long-handled peel. This wooden shovel with its broad, flat blade was an extension of his own arm, allowing him to place the dough deep inside without searing his own skin. In a cool, dry corner, sacks of grain were stacked high, the raw fuel for this entire operation. There were no quiet moments here, only the relentless rhythm of fire, dough, and heat. It was a hot, flour-dusted, and exhausting workplace where civilization's most basic need was met with sheer, unrelenting labor. The flour that filled the air of the bakery began its life miles away, in the open fields surrounding the town. Here, peasants toiled on strips of land, their lives dictated by the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of the manor lord. under the feudal system, these farmers did not truly own the grain they grew. A significant portion of their harvest, sometimes as much as half, was owed directly to the lord as a form of rent for the land they worked. This was the first and most critical transfer in a long and fragile chain. The collected grain, now the property of the lord, would then begin its next journey, one that was often tightly controlled. It was transported to the manorial mill, a large water-driven or wind-powered building that was a hub of activity and frequently a source of resentment. The lord typically held a legal monopoly on milling, forcing everyone on his land to use his mill and pay his price. The miller, operating this crucial machine, took his own cut for the service, a portion of grain known as the miller's toll. This system created a figure who was both essential and often deeply mistrusted. A dishonest miller might mix a customer's high-quality wheat with cheaper, inferior grains like rye or barley before grinding it, pocketing the difference. Or he might manipulate the scales, claiming a larger toll than he was rightfully owed. The flour that finally emerged was the lifeblood of the community, but its path to the baker was already paved with layers of obligation and potential deceit. The baker himself would acquire this flour, either purchasing it from the lord's stores or from a merchant who traded in such goods. His entire enterprise rested on the quality and consistency of this single ingredient. If the harvest failed, the chain broke at its very start. If the miller was corrupt, the baker received poor flour and would be forced to make substandard bread, inviting the anger of his customers and the watchful eyes of the town authorities. This entire network, from the muddy fields to the hot oven, was a precarious balancing act of nature, labor, and human honesty, all converging in the baker's hands to create that one simple, essential loaf. The baker's day began in the deepest dark of night, long before the first church bell would ring for matins. While the rest of the town slept, he was already at work, his world defined by fire and flour. His first and most critical task was to wake the great oven. He would build a fire inside its cavernous brick belly, feeding it for hours with wood until the very stones of the dome glowed with a fierce, dry heat. This was a slow and delicate process, and getting the temperature wrong could ruin an entire day's batch of bread. As the fire roared, he turned to the dough that had been left to rise overnight in its massive wooden troughs. Kneading this substance was not the gentle, therapeutic activity we might think of today. It was a brutal, full-body exertion. The baker would heave his weight onto hundreds of pounds of dense, sticky dough, pushing, folding, and pounding it into submission. His arms and back ached with the strain, a constant companion in his life. Once the oven was ready, the fire was scraped out and the hot chamber cleaned with a wet mop. Then, with a skill born of endless repetition, he used his long wooden peel to slide the raw, shaped loaves deep into the scorching heat. The timing was everything. The first batch needed to be ready just as the sun began to lighten the sky, for his customers would be at his door at dawn. The heat in the bakery was unrelenting, a suffocating blanket that clung to him through every season. Flour dust coated his skin and filled his lungs. He existed on fragments of sleep, his life a cycle of mixing, proving, baking, and selling, repeated 6 days a week and sometimes 7. There were no holidays from hunger. The town's demand for its daily bread was as constant as the sunrise, and his own body was the engine that met that demand, paying for the community's stability with his own sweat and exhaustion. The bread that emerged from that fiery oven was far more than mere sustenance. It was a perfect, edible map of the entire social order. For the vast majority of people in a medieval town, the daily loaf was a dense, dark, and heavy thing. It was often called maslin or sometimes horse bread, names that hinted at its coarse nature. This was not the simple wheat bread we know today. It was a practical mixture of whatever grains were most affordable and available, typically rye and barley, with a little wheat added if they were lucky. The flour was often left unbolted, meaning it contained all the coarse bran and sharp husks from the grain. Every mouthful was gritty, and the resulting loaf was so hard and durable it could easily double as a plate, a trencher, to soak up the juices of a stew. This was the fuel of the peasant, the artisan, and the laborer, providing a belly-filling base for their meager diet. Its dark color and rough texture were badges of a hard life, visible for all to see. At the very top of society, a completely different bread was served. This was manchet, a fine, white loaf made from the most expensive, highly refined wheat flour. To create this flour, millers would sift it repeatedly through ever finer cloths to remove every last speck of brown bran. The process was wasteful, throwing away a significant portion of the grain that held much of its nutrition, but it produced a pure, white powder that was a luxury item. The resulting manchet bread was soft, light, and subtly flavored, a world away from the chewy maslin. Eating this bread was a clear statement of wealth and status, a daily reminder that its consumer did not engage in manual labor. The baker, therefore, was not just producing food, he was actively baking the hierarchy itself. His oven produced both the dark, sustaining loaf for the many and the delicate, luxurious loaf for the few, a daily ritual that reinforced the invisible walls between classes. Sometimes, when grain was scarce or a customer was particularly poor, the baker might even stretch his flour with dried peas, beans, or ground acorns. These additions made the bread even heavier and less palatable, a last resort against hunger. So the next time you picture a medieval feast, look past the roasted meats and look at the bread on the table. Its color, its texture, and its very ingredients would have told you everything you needed to know about the person eating it. But the baker's work was never a private affair. Every loaf he sold was subject to a set of rigid, mathematical rules designed to protect the public and maintain order. In 13th century England, a revolutionary piece of legislation known as the Assize of Bread and Ale laid down the law for bakers in astonishing detail. This was not a suggestion, it was a medieval system of price and quality control that governed every single transaction. The core principle was both brilliant and brutally simple. The law directly tied the weight and the price of a standard loaf to the ever-fluctuating market price of wheat. When the price of grain was low, a penny loaf was supposed to be large and heavy. When a poor harvest drove grain prices up, that same 1 penny loaf would be made smaller and lighter. The price to the consumer remained stable, a single, constant penny, while the baker adjusted the size of the loaf to reflect his own cost. This system prevented bakers from price gouging during a famine, but it also protected their right to a fair profit when times were good. To enforce this, town officials carried official brass weights. They would perform surprise inspections, pulling loaves directly from the baker's shelf and placing them on a balance scale. If a loaf was found to be underweight, the baker was not simply given a warning. The punishments were severe and deeply public, meant to serve as a stark lesson to everyone. For a first offense, a baker might face a heavy fine. Repeat offenders, or those caught adulterating their flour with cheap fillers like sand or ground beans, faced much harsher penalties. They could be locked in the pillory, a wooden frame in the public square, with the offending, underweight loaf tied around their neck. For the most serious and persistent cheats, the law prescribed being dragged through the filthy streets on a hurdle, a kind of wooden sled with the evidence of their crime displayed for all to see. This public shaming was designed to destroy the one thing a baker needed most, the trust of his community. In a world where bread was life, cheating on its quality was not seen as a simple crime. It was an act of social betrayal, a direct threat to the stability of the entire town, and the law treated it with a severity we can scarcely imagine today. Within the walls of the manor, the baker was not a free businessman. He was a serf bound by law and custom to the land he worked on. His hands did not bake for profit but for obligation. A central part of his rent was paid not in coin but in bread. This feudal baker was required to supply the lord's household with a set number of loaves each week, baked from the lord's own grain. This daily tribute of bread was the fuel that powered the castle's knights, servants, and administrators. It was a direct transfer of sustenance from the land to its ruler, a physical symbol of the Lord's power. But the baker's duties did not end there. The Lord typically owned the only oven for miles around, a massive structure that represented a powerful monopoly. Every other peasant family on the manor was forbidden from building their own oven. Instead, they were forced to bring their own shaped dough to the manorial baker, who would then bake it for them in the Lord's oven for a fee. This practice was known as soak rights, and it was a brilliant system of control and income. Think of a modern apartment building where the landlord owns the only laundry machine and charges every tenant to use it. Now imagine that machine is the only legal way to cook your food. That was the reality of medieval life. The fee for this service, paid in grain or a small coin, went directly into the Lord's coffers. For the peasant family, it meant that even the simple act of turning their own flour into edible bread came with a tax. For the baker, it meant his work was never his own. His days were split between his compulsory service to the Lord and the endless stream of dough brought in by his neighbors. He was both a servant and a public utility, trapped in the middle of a system designed to extract value from every single step of life. The warmth of his oven was not a sign of his independence, but a constant reminder of his place in a chain of command that stretched from the dough trough directly up to the Lord's high table. Even in a world of strict laws, a baker needed more than just official protection. He needed a community of his own. In the growing towns and cities, this need gave rise to the Bakers' Guild, a powerful institution that controlled every aspect of the craft. The guild was far more than a simple trade association. It was a fortress built to protect its members from competition, to enforce quality from within, and to create a closed, self-policing world. To become a master baker was not a matter of simply knowing how to bake. It was a grueling journey that began in childhood. A boy, often as young as 12, would be formally apprenticed to a master. His parents would pay a fee and sign a contract binding him for years, sometimes as many as 7. During that time, he was not a student in the modern sense. He was property. He lived in the master's house, ate at his table, and obeyed his every command. His days were filled with the most menial tasks, from sweeping the flour-dusted floor to fetching wood for the great oven. Only slowly, after proving his dedication and trustworthiness, would he be taught the secrets of the trade, the precise feel of perfectly kneaded dough, the intuitive knowledge of when the oven was at the perfect heat. This long and strict system ensured that only those with immense patience and skill could ever rise to the top. It was designed to create not just competent bakers, but guardians of a sacred tradition. Once a journeyman, a baker could work for wages, but he could not open his own shop. To become a master and join the guild, he had to produce his masterpiece, a staggering quantity of bread of such perfect quality that the guild masters would approve it. The guild's control was absolute. It decided how many masters could operate in a town, preventing any one baker from being undercut by too many competitors. It set the rules for quality, inspecting members' bread to ensure no one was cheating and dragging the reputation of all bakers down. But the guild's power extended far beyond the bakery door. It was a social safety net in a world with no government aid. If a master baker fell ill or died, the guild would provide for his widow and orphans. It settled disputes between members without needing to involve the town authorities, and it organized religious festivals and processions, making the bakers a visible and respected pillar of the community. This collective power translated directly into political influence. Guild masters often held seats on the town council, where they could lobby for laws that benefited their trade and block those that harmed it. They were not just bakers, they were politicians, shaping the very rules that fed the city. The guild created a world within a world, a closed and powerful community where the price of bread and the fate of the men who made it were carefully and collectively managed. A baker's oven was never reserved for bread alone. Its scorching heat was a versatile tool, called upon to produce a whole range of goods that served the community in unexpected ways. The most common of these was the humble trencher. This was not a piece of fine pottery, but a thick, day-old slice of coarse bread, typically from a large, round Maslin loaf. It was hardened and stale by design, meant to be placed on the table to act as an edible plate. A family would heap their stewed meat and vegetables directly onto this bread base. The trencher would soak up the juices and gravies, becoming flavored and softened through the meal. After everyone had eaten their fill, the gravy-soaked trencher itself became the final course, eaten by the diners if they were still hungry, or more often, collected and given to the poor waiting at the kitchen door or tossed to the household's pigs and dogs. In this one simple item, the baker provided both a dish and a portion of the meal, creating a system with absolutely no waste, but his skills extended far beyond the dinner table. The same baker who made your daily loaf might also craft a durable pie with a crust so thick and tough it was practically inedible. This was not a failure of baking, but a brilliant form of medieval food preservation. These sturdy crusts, sometimes called coffins, were not meant to be eaten. They were durable containers designed to hold a filling of meat and gravy, sealing it inside for days or even weeks. The hard, dry pastry acted as a protective barrier, keeping the contents relatively fresh without refrigeration. A traveler or a soldier could carry this self-contained meal for a long journey, breaking open the crust when it was time to eat and discarding it afterward. For even longer voyages, especially at sea, the baker produced hardtack, a simple biscuit made from nothing more than flour, water, and sometimes salt. These were baked until all moisture was driven out, creating a rock-hard wafer that could survive for months, even years, in a ship's hold. They were infamous for becoming so hard that sailors would often dunk them in their gruel or coffee for a long time just to make them soft enough to chew, and they were a common hiding place for weevils and other pests. Yet, these simple biscuits kept navies and explorers fed across the oceans, and on rare, special occasions, the baker's art turned toward celebration. Using precious honey, dried fruits, and spices imported at great cost, he would create sweet pastries and spiced cakes for feast days and weddings. These were luxuries that broke the monotony of the daily diet, tangible symbols of joy and prosperity. So the baker was far more than just the man who made your bread. He was the creator of your plate, the preserver of your meat, the provisioner for your journeys, and the architect of your celebrations, his hot oven serving as the versatile heart of daily medieval life. In the smallest villages, the baker's oven was not just his own. It was the heart of the entire community, a single, shared source of heat that served every household. Here, most families could not dream of owning a private oven. The cost of building and maintaining such a massive, fireproof structure was far beyond their means. Instead, they became masters of dough preparation within their own humble homes. A housewife would mix her flour with water and a piece of saved sourdough starter from the last batch, kneading it on her own table. She would then carefully shape the loaves and carry them, balanced on a wooden board, to the one place that could transform them, the communal bakery. This daily pilgrimage turned the baker's yard into a bustling social crossroads. It was a place where you were guaranteed to meet your neighbors, where the air was thick not just with the smell of baking bread, but with the latest news and whispered secrets. The baker, standing at the center of this flow of people and dough, became much more than a tradesman. He was the guardian of the fire, the manager of the queue, and the most well-informed person in the village. His ears caught every piece of gossip, every complaint about the Lord's taxes, every announcement of a birth or a death. He knew who was prospering and who was struggling simply by the size and quality of the dough they brought him. To prevent chaos and ensure every family received their own bread, a simple but brilliant system was used. Each household owned a unique dough stamp, a small wooden carving with a distinctive pattern, perhaps a cross, a star, or a family symbol. Before bringing her raw loaves to the bakery, the woman of the house would press this stamp firmly into the top of each one, leaving her unmistakable mark in the soft dough. As the bread baked, this impression would set, becoming a permanent signature on the crust. When the baker pulled the golden, steaming loaves from the shared heat, he could easily sort them, returning the correct ones to each waiting customer. This practice of stamping was not just about identification. It was a ritual of trust and community, a physical promise that your precious food would be returned to you from the common fire. The baker's role in this system was profound. He had to be scrupulously honest, managing the timing for dozens of families without ever mixing up their stamped loaves. A mistake could mean one family went hungry while another feasted, shattering the delicate trust that held the village together. His bakery was the original social network, a hot, bustling hub where the community was literally forged in fire, and where the simple act of baking bread wove the individual lives of a village into a single, sustaining whole. The sheer scale of this daily operation defies modern comprehension. To feed a town of 5,000 people, a community needed to produce thousands of loaves every single day. Each person, from the smallest child to the oldest laborer, might consume a pound or more of bread daily. That single fact transforms the quiet bakery into a roaring industrial plant powered by human muscle and fire. The numbers are staggering. 5,000 people could easily require over 5,000 pounds of flour each day, the product of countless acres of farmland, the labor of dozens of millers, and the coordinated effort of multiple bakeries. A single large oven, fired to its maximum capacity, might hold 100 or 200 loaves at a time, but with each batch taking well over an hour to bake, one baker and one oven could never keep up. The solution was a relentless 24-hour cycle of production. The master baker and his team did not work in shifts, they worked in a continuous, exhausting relay. While one batch was in the oven, another was being kneaded, and a third was rising in its trough. The fire in the great oven was never allowed to die completely. As soon as one load of bread was pulled out, the next was ready to be slid in. The residual heat from the previous bake used to start the next, conserving precious fuel and time. This sequential baking meant the bakery was a place of perpetual motion, its rhythm dictated not by the sun, but by the internal clock of fermentation and heat. No single man could sustain this pace. This is where the apprentices and journeymen became essential. A successful bakery was not a one-man operation, it was a small crew. A master might employ 2 or 3 journeymen and several apprentices, all working in a coordinated frenzy. The apprentices would endlessly fetch wood, mix new batches of dough in the massive troughs, and shape the loaves. The journeymen, with their hardened skills, would manage the fire and wield the heavy peel, their movements precise and economical, wasting not a single motion. They worked in the suffocating heat, their world a blur of flour and flame, stopping only for brief meals and fragments of sleep. And even this coordinated effort was often not enough for a growing town. Most medieval settlements were not served by one central bakery. Instead, multiple bakeries would be scattered across different parishes or districts, each one serving its own immediate neighborhood. This was a brilliant, decentralized system. It reduced the distance people had to walk for their daily bread and prevented a single point of failure, like a fire or an illness, from crippling the entire town's food supply. Each bakery became the heart of its own small world, a familiar landmark where the baker knew his customers by name and by the dough stamp they used. So the next time you walk through a quiet neighborhood, try to picture not one, but several of these hot, bustling workshops operating simultaneously, their ovens glowing throughout the night, their collective output a silent, daily miracle that held the entire urban world together. Yet for all the laws and the guild's watchful eyes, a powerful temptation always lingered in the flour-dusted air. The baker's profit margins were often razor-thin, and the pressure to stretch his expensive flour could lead to dark and desperate choices. An unscrupulous baker might secretly blend his grain with much cheaper and completely inedible fillers. White chalk or white clay could be ground into a fine powder and mixed with the flour, making the resulting dough appear whiter and more desirable while adding deceptive weight. Sawdust swept up from the carpenter's floor could be sifted into the mix to bulk out the loaf. In the most grim circumstances, some were even known to use ground animal bones, a substance that added a gritty, pale bulk to the dough. These adulterations were not just harmless cheating, they were a direct attack on public health. A loaf filled with sawdust or bone meal offered little nutrition, leaving a laborer's stomach full but his body weak and starving for real sustenance. It was a silent, invisible crime, one that could go unnoticed until the community's health began to fail. To combat this hidden danger, towns employed a special official known as the ale conner. While his title suggests he only inspected ale, his duties often extended to bread as well. These men were the food detectives of their day, armed with practical, almost theatrical, methods of detection. One common test for flour purity involved taking a sample and rubbing it vigorously between the palms. Pure, high-quality flour would feel smooth and soft. Flour adulterated with gritty substances like ground bone or sand would feel harsh and abrasive against the skin. Another test used a simple piece of dark, coarse woolen cloth. The official would press a handful of flour onto the fabric. Pure, white wheat flour would fall away cleanly, leaving little trace, but flour mixed with heavy white clay or chalk would leave a distinct, pale stain on the dark wool, a clear mark of guilt. When a baker was caught, the punishment was designed to be as public and humiliating as his crime was secret. He would be dragged from his shop and placed in the town's pillory, a wooden frame that locked his head and hands in place for all to see. The offending, fraudulent loaves would be tied around his neck or crumbled and broken over his head. The townspeople, the very people he had poisoned for profit, were then encouraged to express their fury. They might pelt him with rotten food, mud, or even the very stones he had added to his flour. For a repeat offender, the penalty escalated dramatically. He could be dragged through the filthy streets on a hurdle, a wooden sled used to transport criminals, with the evidence of his fraud displayed for all to see. In some towns, his own oven might be destroyed, or he could be banished from the city gates forever, losing his livelihood and his place in the community. This brutal public shaming was a calculated deterrent. In a world built on trust, destroying a baker's reputation was a punishment far worse than any fine. It served as a constant, chilling reminder that the line between respected craftsman and public enemy was as thin as a wafer. But that fear of the scale created a strange and lasting legacy, a phrase we still use today without knowing its grim origin. We call it the baker's dozen, a term that simply means 13. Why would a baker give away an extra loaf for free? This was not an act of generosity. It was a brilliant and calculated insurance policy against the draconian punishments of the assize of bread. The law demanded that a dozen loaves, when weighed together, must meet a strict minimum weight. But bread is a living thing, and its weight can change as it bakes and cools. A batch of dough that seemed perfect might lose just a little too much moisture in the oven's heat, causing the final batch of 12 loaves to fall slightly, yet dangerously, under the legal weight. For the baker, that tiny, unintentional shortfall could mean financial ruin or public humiliation in the pillory. His solution was both simple and shrewd. To guarantee that any random dozen loaves he sold would always meet the weight requirement, he would add a 13th loaf to every order. This extra loaf was his buffer, his margin of safety. If the first 12 were a little light, the 13th would push the total weight safely over the legal line. This practice transformed the baker's dozen from a simple transaction into a fascinating glimpse into the medieval mind. It reveals a world where the law was so unforgiving that it forced craftsmen to build a cushion of charity into their very business model, not out of goodwill but out of sheer rational fear. That one extra loaf was the price of doing business in a society where a single ounce of bread could tip the scales between prosperity and disaster. That dense, coarse loaf was more than just a meal. It was the very fuel that powered the entire medieval world. Every physically demanding task, from the peasant swinging his scythe in the field to the mason hoisting stone for a cathedral, required a staggering amount of energy. The dark, heavy bread made from mixed grains was perfectly designed to provide it. This was not a delicate food. It was a slow-burning caloric engine, packed with complex carbohydrates from its whole grains and fortified with fiber from the bran left in the flour. A single 1-pound loaf of this Maslin bread could contain well over 1,000 calories. For a field laborer or a soldier on the march, this was not a luxury, it was an absolute necessity. Historical records suggest a grown man performing hard physical labor might consume between 2 and 3 pounds of bread each day. Think of that. His daily diet was essentially a few of these massive, rugged loaves, supplemented with a little pottage, some ale, and perhaps a sliver of cheese. The bread was his primary fuel source, the caloric bedrock that allowed his muscles to work from dawn until dusk. Without this steady, reliable intake of calories, the entire economic and military machine would have simply ground to a halt. An army could not march on an empty stomach. Its soldiers needed the energy to carry heavy packs, wield weapons, and build fortifications. The entire campaign plan, from the king's grand strategy down to the movement of individual regiments, was entirely dependent on supply wagons filled with sacks of flour or, more commonly, with hard-baked biscuits and loaves. A broken supply line meant a broken army, not from battle but from starvation. The same principle applied to every other trade. The blacksmith sweating at his forge, the carpenter hewing massive timbers, the weaver operating his heavy loom, all drew their strength from the baker's oven. The construction of a single Gothic cathedral, a project spanning generations, required millions of man-hours of backbreaking labor. That labor was sustained by millions of loaves of bread. The entire monument, in a very real sense, was built not just from stone and mortar, but from the transformed energy of grain. The affordable, consistent availability of bread was the silent, non-negotiable prerequisite for every other form of medieval enterprise. When the bread supply was secure, society could build, craft, and conquer. When it failed, everything else faltered with it. The baker, therefore, stood at the very center of this system. His daily success did not just fill stomachs, it fueled the armies that defended kingdoms and built the wonders that defined an age. A terrible silence could fall over the busiest bakery. It was the silence of an empty grain sack, a sound more frightening than any angry mob. When harvests failed or a siege choked supply lines, the entire system we have traced from field to oven began to tear at the seams. For the baker, these moments transformed his daily struggle into an impossible nightmare. The price of grain would skyrocket overnight, but the law of the assize still demanded he sell his loaves for a single, stable penny. His only legal option was to make those penny loaves smaller and lighter, a shrinking loaf that felt like theft to his hungry customers. He was caught in a brutal vise, crushed between the rock of his own soaring costs and the hard place of public fury. Imagine his position on a cold morning during a famine. A line of desperate, hollow-eyed people forms at his door, their last coins clutched in trembling hands. He knows his flour is nearly gone, and what little remains cost him a fortune. If he bakes all his bread and sells it, he will be bankrupt, his business finished. If he raises his prices beyond what the law allows, he will be fined into oblivion or dragged to the pillory. But if he closes his shop declaring he has no bread to sell, he risks something far worse. A rumor of an empty bakery could ignite a flash fire of panic, turning that desperate line into a raging mob that would not just loot his shop but tear it apart beam by beam. His livelihood, his home, and his very life hung in the balance with every loaf he did or did not produce. In these moments of ultimate crisis, the baker became the solitary face of a collapsing system, the man everyone blamed. The town authorities knew this danger all too well. To prevent the explosion, they would often intervene with heavy-handed measures. They might impose strict price caps, forcing bakers to sell at a loss to maintain order. More effectively, they would sometimes release emergency grain stores held in municipal granaries, selling it to the bakers at a controlled price or even distributing it directly. This was not an act of pure charity, it was a calculated move for survival. The goal was to get bread, any bread, into the hands of the populace to stave off riots. The quality did not matter. Loaves might be made from old, musty grain or stretched with every available filler, from acorns to dried peas. The baker's art became one of pure desperation, his oven producing not nourishment but the bare minimum required to keep the peace. During a siege, the pressure reached an unbearable peak. The town gates were sealed, locking everyone inside with a finite supply of grain. The baker's oven became the throbbing heart of the community's endurance. Rations were slashed, and the daily loaf grew smaller and darker, sometimes becoming little more than a baked paste of bran and water. The authorities would guard the bakery and the grain stores with soldiers, not to protect the baker, but to protect the bread from being seized by a starving populace. In this suffocating atmosphere, the baker worked under armed watch, his every movement scrutinized. He was no longer a craftsman, but a vital cog in the city's final defenses. If his oven went cold, hope died with it. The simple, golden crust of a loaf became the fragile barrier between a functioning society and utter chaos, and the man who made it held that barrier in his flour-dusted, trembling hands. Once the final batch of bread was pulled from the scorching chamber, the great oven's work was far from over. Its retained heat, a precious and expensive resource, would not be allowed to go to waste. This massive brick structure transformed into a versatile, communal kitchen for the entire town. As the afternoon light began to fade, you might see a procession of townsfolk approaching the bakery, each carrying a different earthenware pot. Inside these pots were their family's Sunday dinners, a joint of meat or a savory pottage that had been slowly prepared at home. For a small fee, the baker would slide these personal meals into the gently cooling oven, using the residual heat to cook them through perfectly while the families attended church. This service meant that even households without a proper hearth could enjoy a hot, roasted meal, their individual dinners all cooking together in the shared, lingering warmth. For the wealthier households and the Lord's own castle, the baker's role expanded further. He might be contracted to roast an entire pig or a side of beef in his massive oven, a task impossible in a standard household fireplace. The even, enveloping heat of the brick dome could cook large quantities of meat evenly, making the bakery essential for preparing feasts and large gatherings. The oven's utility stretched even beyond food. Local potters would bring their freshly shaped clay vessels, carefully placing them inside to be fired and hardened by the slowly falling temperature. Brewers relied on the oven's dry warmth to cure the hops needed for their ale, spreading the flours on trays and sliding them inside to preserve their flavor. This single, soot-blackened structure was not just a bread factory, it was the town's roastery, its pottery kiln, and its drying house all in one. Every task it performed after the bread was baked was a testament to medieval ingenuity, a way of squeezing every possible ounce of value from the fire's costly heat. The baker, as the keeper of this essential fire, became the central figure in a wide network of daily life, his oven's embers touching everything from the family dinner to the ale in your mug and the plate you ate from. The quiet rhythm of daily baking shattered when the calendar marked a feast day or the King's Herald rode into town. These extraordinary events demanded an output that pushed the baker and his oven to their absolute limits. A single fair or festival could double or even triple the town's population in a matter of days, as pilgrims and merchants flooded in from the countryside. The ordinary demand for 5,000 loaves a day could suddenly leap to 15,000. To meet this, the bakery transformed into a round-the-clock siege operation. The master baker would call upon every journeyman and apprentice he could find, even hiring temporary laborers to keep the fire fed and the dough troughs full. They worked in relentless, overlapping shifts. While one team slept for a few precious hours on sacks of flour, another team would be kneading a new batch, and a third would be managing the fiery maw of the oven, their movements a blur in the flickering light. The oven itself never cooled. As soon as one batch of standard loaves was drawn out, the next was ready to go in. The residual heat from the previous bake used to start the next, a continuous cycle of fire and bread that stretched for days on end. This was baking as a form of endurance sport, a test of logistics and sheer physical will where a single moment of exhaustion could lead to a ruined batch and a catastrophic shortfall. But this monumental effort went beyond mere quantity. For a royal visit or a major religious holiday, the baker's art ascended to a new level. He would produce special celebration loaves, often called subtlety breads, which were large, intricately shaped, and sometimes even gilded with edible gold leaf. These were not just food, they were edible sculptures, symbols of the town's wealth and piety. For a wedding, he might craft a massive, braided loaf to be shared by the entire community. For a fair, he would bake larger, softer white manchet loaves to be sold at a premium to wealthy visitors. His oven produced not only sustenance for the masses, but also spectacle for the elite, a dual output that showcased his incredible versatility. How did one man manage such a scale? He did not. He became a general, marshalling a small army of flour-dusted soldiers in a battle against time and hunger, proving that the humble bakery could, when called upon, become the engine of a medieval spectacle. Every tool in the baker's workshop was an extension of his own body, a simple device perfected by generations of use. The most iconic was the baker's peel, a long wooden pole with a broad, flat blade at its end. This was not just a shovel, it was a precision instrument. The baker would slide the blade under a formed loaf with a practiced flick of his wrist, then thrust the entire assembly deep into the fiery oven. With a smooth, twisting motion, he would deposit the raw dough onto the hot brick floor and retract the empty peel, all without singeing his arms or disturbing the other loaves. It was a dance of heat and motion, and the length of the peel directly determined how much bread his oven could hold, allowing him to utilize every inch of that scorching space. Beside him stood the massive kneading trough, a container so large it could double as a child's bed. These troughs were carved from single, hollowed-out tree trunks or built from thick, wide planks. Their sheer size was necessary to contain the enormous quantities of dough required for a day's baking. Kneading this mass was a feat of strength, but the high, sloped sides of the trough helped contain the sticky substance, allowing the baker to lean his full weight into the task without the dough spilling over onto the floor. Before the dough even reached the trough, the baker relied on his sieves. He did not have one single sieve, but a collection of them, each with a different weave. A coarse, wide-meshed sieve would remove the largest pieces of husk and stone. A finer mesh, often made from woven horsehair or linen, would produce the whiter, more refined flour for the wealthy man's manchet bread. The baker's choice of sieve was his first and most critical decision, determining the color, texture, and social class of the final loaf. And for those who used the communal oven, the humble dough stamp was perhaps the most important tool of all. This small, carved wooden block, often passed down through families, was a personal signature. Pressing your unique symbol into the soft dough before baking was an act of faith, a guarantee that your family's sustenance would be returned to you from the shared inferno. None of these tools required electricity or complex gears. Their power came from the skill of the human hands that wielded them. Generations of bakers refined the angle of a peel's blade, the ideal depth of a trough, and the perfect tightness of a sieve's weave. This was innovation born of relentless repetition, a slow accumulation of wisdom that allowed one man with simple wooden tools to achieve a level of consistency and efficiency that fed hundreds day after day for centuries. Behind the master baker stood an entire household, a hidden workforce that made the daily miracle possible. The baker's wife was far more than a helper. She was a business partner and manager. While her husband battled the oven's heat, she was often the public face of the operation, running the shop front, handling money, and dealing with customers from dawn until dusk. Her sharp eyes kept track of complex accounts, noting who had paid and who owed for their daily bread or for the use of the communal oven. She managed the household's food and supplies, ensuring that the apprentices were fed and the endless cycle of domestic chores was completed, all while likely assisting with the lighter bakery tasks like shaping loaves or preparing the dough stamps for the communal bakes. The baker's children grew up in this world of flour and fire. From a very young age, they were given small jobs like sweeping the ever-present dust from the floor or fetching water. As they grew older, their responsibilities increased, and they learned the trade by constant exposure, their little hands becoming skilled at tasks their father performed on a massive scale. This family unit was the bedrock of the bakery, a self-contained team where every member, regardless of age, contributed to the survival of the business and, by extension, the town. But the family's home was also a classroom for strangers. The apprentice, a boy sent to live with the baker's family for 7 long years, was the most essential and vulnerable member of this unseen workforce. His parents signed a binding contract and paid a fee, effectively giving their son over to the master. In return, the boy received no wages, only basic food, a roof over his head, and the promise of an education in the craft. His life was one of relentless servitude. His days began before the sun and ended long after it set, filled with the most grueling and monotonous tasks. He was the one who hauled the heavy sacks of grain, who endlessly swept the hot ashes from the great oven, and who fetched wood and water until his arms ached. He was the first to rise and the last to sleep, his existence defined by obedience and exhaustion. This was not cruelty for its own sake, it was a brutal filtering system. The master was testing the boy's character, his resilience, and his dedication. Only after years of proving his trustworthiness and work ethic would the master begin to reveal the true secrets of the craft, the precise feel of perfectly proofed dough, the intuitive knowledge of oven temperature, the subtle tricks for getting the most from a sack of flour. The apprentice's life was a transaction, his youth and labor traded for the priceless knowledge that would one day grant him a place in the world as a master craftsman, ensuring that the vital art of baking would not die with one generation but would be passed on to the next. The steady, rhythmic creak of the mill wheel was the baker's constant companion, a sound that promised the flour for his next batch of dough. This was the crucial partner to his hot oven, the machine that turned hard grain into soft powder. The most common of these was the watermill, a marvel of medieval engineering built along the banks of a fast-flowing river. Its massive wooden wheel, turned by the relentless push of the current, was just the beginning. Through a complex arrangement of wooden gears and shafts, that slow, powerful rotation was transferred inside the mill house, where it spun a heavy upper millstone against a stationary lower stone. The grain fed between these two stones was crushed and ground into flour, its quality controlled by the precise gap between them, adjusted by the miller with a subtle tap of a wooden lever. This water-powered system could produce vast quantities of flour day and night, making it the engine of large manors and growing towns, but not every landscape had a reliable river. In flatter, wind-swept regions, a different giant rose against the sky later in the medieval period, the tower windmill. Its entire top, cap and all, could be physically turned by a long tail pole to face the shifting wind, catching the breeze in its cloth-covered sails. This harnessed power then spun the millstones below with a force that could be terrifyingly strong in a gale. While more dependent on the whims of the weather than a steady river, a single windmill could grind enough grain in one day to feed a small village for a week. Yet for the poorest families, neither of these technological wonders were an option. they were forced to rely on the hand quern, a simple device of two small, flat stones. This was grinding by pure, exhausting muscle power. A person, usually the woman of the household, would spend hours every day kneeling over the quern, gripping a handle and rotating the top stone in a ceaseless circular grind. It was back-breaking, slow labor that produced only a tiny trickle of coarse, gritty meal, barely enough for a single family's daily bread. The efficiency of the mill was not an abstract concept, it was the direct determinant of the baker's cost and the town's survival. A powerful watermill operating consistently produced abundant, affordable flour, keeping the price of bread stable and the populace calm. A broken mill wheel or a week of still air, however, created an immediate crisis. The baker's costs would soar as he competed for scarce flour, forcing him to shrink his loaves and inviting the suspicion of his customers and the wrath of the town officials. The entire food chain, from the peasant's field to the golden crust on the baker's shelf, pivoted on the smooth, relentless turning of the millstone. That simple loaf resting on the table held a meaning far beyond its weight in grain. In the medieval mind, bread was a sacred object, a tangible piece of grace woven into the very fabric of their spiritual and cultural world. Its most profound role was at the heart of the Christian faith, in the ritual of the Eucharist. During the Mass, the priest would consecrate a wafer of unleavened bread, and for the faithful, this was not a symbol, it was a miracle. They believed it truly became the body of Christ, a divine sustenance for the soul. This transformative act elevated the very concept of bread, casting a holy shadow over the work of the baker who produced its earthly form. His craft, turning simple flour into life-giving food, mirrored a sacred mystery. The baker did not just make breakfast, he handled the raw material of a miracle, and this imbued his hot, dusty profession with a sense of solemn purpose. This deep reverence spilled over into daily life through a web of folklore and superstition. It was considered a grave sin to waste bread, with many believing that every crumb thrown away would have to be accounted for in the afterlife. A common practice was to mark a cross on the bottom of a loaf before baking, not just for identification, but as a blessing and a protective charm. People would keep a crust of bread in their pocket when traveling to ward off evil spirits or misfortune. They believed that something so fundamental to life carried a power that could protect life itself. Old, hardened bread was not simply discarded. It was often placed in the foundations of a new home or barn as a blessing for prosperity and to guard against lightning strikes. Even our language preserves this ancient connection. We speak of someone being the breadwinner, the person who brings home the sustenance for the family. We refer to something that provides a living as our daily bread. These are not empty phrases, they are echoes from a time when bread was synonymous with life itself. The baker, therefore, stood at a unique crossroads. He was a practical businessman governed by strict laws and the relentless demands of the market. Yet he was also the keeper of a sacred trust, the man whose hands produced the substance that fed both the body and the soul of his community. His oven's heat warmed more than just his bakery, it warmed the core beliefs of an entire civilization. The medieval baker would not recognize the quiet hum of a modern bakery. His world was one of survival, not variety, a daily battle against hunger and the law. Today, a baker chooses from 100 different flours, each with a specific protein content and origin, while his medieval counterpart worked with whatever grain the harvest or the miller provided, a constant gamble on quality. The most fundamental difference lies in the very heart of the process, the ingredient that makes bread rise. The modern baker reaches for a packet of instant commercial yeast, a standardized, predictable organism that acts with swift efficiency. The medieval baker relied on a sourdough starter, a living, breathing culture of wild yeast and bacteria that he had to nurture like a child. This starter was passed down through generations, its unique microbial signature giving his bread a distinct, tangy flavor, but it was also fragile and unpredictable. A change in the weather, a draft in the bakery, or simple bad luck could cause it to fail, leaving him with flat, dense loaves and a line of angry, hungry customers. This single contrast defines their entire existence, one built on biological certainty, the other on a fragile, living symbiosis. The scale of their labor is equally worlds apart. A modern artisan might bake 200 loaves in a day, focusing on craft and unique recipes. The medieval baker, however, was an industrial engine, his single oven producing hundreds of loaves in a continuous day and night cycle to prevent a town from starving. His work was measured in the survival of thousands, not in the satisfaction of a few dozen customers. The modern baker works within health codes and business licenses, frameworks designed for safety and fair competition. The medieval baker operated under the assize of bread, a law that governed the weight and price of every single loaf with draconian punishment for failure. He was not just a businessman, he was a public servant whose personal liberty was on the line with every batch. A bad day for a modern baker means lost profit, but a bad day for his medieval ancestor could mean the pillory, his reputation destroyed before the very community that depended on him. This constant threat of public shame forged a different kind of craftsman, one whose primary goal was not artistry or variety, but consistency and volume under the watchful eyes of the law. The modern bakery window displays a rainbow of options from ciabatta to croissants, each a testament to creative expression and market demand. The medieval baker's shelf held one or two types of loaf, their color and texture dictated not by choice but by social class and the grim economics of grain. His art was not in variety, but in perfecting a single, life-sustaining process under the most intense pressure imaginable. One profession seeks to delight the palate and turn a profit, while the other carried the crushing responsibility of holding a civilization together, one golden crust at a time. That legacy of fire and flour did not vanish with the Middle Ages. It was baked into the foundations of our modern world, its patterns and principles echoing through our cities and our laws. The powerful Bakers' Guild, for instance, did not simply disappear. It evolved. The Guild's core mission of protecting its members, regulating quality, and training the next generation transformed over centuries into the very structure of modern trade unions and professional associations. Just as the Guild controlled who could become a master baker and ensured fair wages for its journeymen, today's unions negotiate collective bargaining agreements and uphold workplace safety standards. The Guild's meticulous quality inspections find their direct descendant in the professional certifications and licensing boards that guarantee the skill of an electrician, a plumber, or a surgeon. That medieval instinct to band together for mutual protection and to uphold a standard of craft became a blueprint for how we organize skilled labor to this day. The long arm of the law, represented by the assize of bread and its fearsome ale conner, also stretches into our time. The draconian punishments are gone, but the fundamental idea that the public has a right to safe, unadulterated food is now a cornerstone of government. The surprise inspections and standardized weights of the 13th century were the crude but direct ancestors of agencies like the Food and Drug Administration. Where a medieval official rubbed flour on a piece of wool to detect chalk, a modern lab uses chromatography to identify chemical contaminants. The principle, however, remains unchanged. Society has a duty to protect its citizens from those who would poison their food for profit. Our intricate web of food labeling, nutritional facts, and health codes is the direct intellectual heir of those first, desperate attempts to bring order to the chaotic and often dangerous medieval marketplace. And what of the bread itself? For centuries after the medieval period, that dense, coarse loaf remained the absolute center of the human diet. The working class of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries still relied on bread for the vast majority of their calories, just as the medieval peasant had. The famous French Revolution was sparked not by abstract ideals of liberty alone, but by the very tangible crisis of bread shortages and soaring prices, a direct parallel to the medieval bread riots that terrified every town official. The cry of "let them eat cake" was so enraging precisely because it revealed a ruling class utterly divorced from the reality that bread was life. This central role persisted until astonishingly recently, only truly fading with the agricultural and economic shifts of the 20th century. Perhaps the most visible legacy is etched into our city streets. Walk through any old European town or even neighborhoods in newer cities, and you can still see the ghost of the medieval baker's shop. It was the original convenience store, a place you visited every single day. This constant foot traffic established the bakery as a permanent community anchor, a role it never fully relinquished. The warm, inviting smell of baking bread still draws people in, just as it did centuries ago. The bakery counter remains a place for gossip and conversation, a hub of local news. This model of a daily, essential, and social retail establishment shaped how we think about our neighborhoods. The modern coffee shop, with its daily regulars and its role as a social crossroads, owes a deep, unacknowledged debt to the medieval bakery. That simple, golden crust did more than fill stomachs. It forged habits of community and commerce that are woven into the very fabric of our urban lives, a quiet testament to the enduring power of the baker's fire. From the first light of the manna mill to the final golden crust cooling on the shelf, the journey of a single loaf was a masterpiece of human collaboration. We have traced this path from the peasant's field, through the miller's often suspect hands, and into the blistering heat of the bakery, where one man stood at the center of it all. The medieval baker was never just a simple craftsman. He was a businessman navigating brutal laws, a public servant managing a communal resource, and a community pillar whose daily success determined the town's stability. He was the linchpin in a system of astonishing complexity, a delicate chain of nature, labor, and law that had to hold firm every single day. With nothing but a wood-fired oven and his own exhausted hands, this historical figure solved one of humanity's oldest and most pressing mysteries: how to feed thousands in a world without industrial machines. The next time you pass a bakery and catch that warm, familiar scent, remember the immense legacy behind it. Think of the generations of bakers who turned grain into power and flour into community, building civilization itself one loaf at a time. We would love to hear your thoughts, or if you know of any historic bakeries still standing in your own part of the world, share their stories in the comments below.